Hi, my name is Dale Maley. Today we're going to talk about a way to make some neat handles for your hand-cranked wood models. A little history on this project. I've now made over 50 of the hand-cranked wood models over the last 15 years or so. The very first models I built, they just used dowels as the hand crank handle. And you get a little bit of friction when you're doing that. They work, but you still get a little bit of heat or friction in your hand. I remember as a kid, my grandpa Harold Dameron had a bench grinder that you cranked by hand. And on that unit, the handle rotated and was not fixed to the crank arm. It was a lot more comfortable to operate that old bench grinder. Now here's a photo of one of my earlier wood models I built 10 years ago, back in 2014. And on that one, the green dowel here was the crank handle. And as I said, you kind of get some friction if you rub that fast enough or crank it fast enough. Now here's an example of what my grandfather's old hand-cranked bench grinder looked like. It wasn't the same, but this was kind of what he had. And you'll notice the red handle there stays fixed in your hand while you crank it. And I got to wondering, how could I modify this design to make it fit for my wood models? So here's a drawing in SketchUp of what my improved design looks like. And on the left you'll have a crank arm. You could, instead of just a plain arm, you could make a decorative wheel also. Doesn't really matter. The red handle, that stays fixed in your hand while you crank. You'll see kind of an orangish colored retention sleeve that keeps the crank handle from flying off to the right. And last is the blue 3/8 dowel, which is glued onto the crank arm and is also glued onto the retention sleeve. Here is a cross-sectional view of the crank handle. Inside is the blue 3/8" dowel, which is glued onto the crank handle, and then on the right hand side it's glued onto the retention sleeve. The red is the handle itself. I make that from 1¼ diameter dowel. I cut off a piece about 2½ inches long. I bore a 7/8 diameter hole about 3/4 deep. Then I bore a 3/8 hole the rest of the way through it. Then last is a retention sleeve itself with a 3/4 inch OD, 3/8 ID. You'll glue that onto the 3/8 dowel. And the retention sleeve is 3/4 inch long. Now I actually make the handle on my wood lathe. I start out by sawing a 1¼ diameter dowel to a 2½ inch length, step 1. Step 2 is to chuck it in the lathe. I use the tailstock then to drill a 7/8 inch diameter hole, 3/4 inch deep, and I use a Forstner bit. Step 3, I change the bit from 7/8 down to 3/8 diameter, and I drill the handle the rest of the way through. On step 4, I round over the end and I sand it to 220 grit while it's still in the lathe. On step 5, I flip it end for end. I round over that end and sand it also to 220 grit in the lathe. The last step, which is step 6, I remove the handle from the lathe. Then I sand the crank end down to 220 grit, and that finishes up the handle. I use the scroll saw to make my retention sleeve. It's rather a fragile part. So step 1, I select an oak board that is standard 3/4 inch thickness. Step 2, I use a compass or a plastic template. I draw both a 3/8 and a 3/4 inch diameter circles. Step 3, I drill a 3/8 hole in the center using a Forstner bit. Step 4, I make the 3/8 inch hole slightly larger using a wood rasp because you need some clearance for the 3/8 inch mating dowel. Make sure and test your fit with the dowel before you proceed. The last step, number 5, is to scroll saw the 3/4 inch hole. And note, if you try to enlarge the hole after you finish the sleeve using a wood rasp, it's likely you're going to split that sleeve. Now for the fun part, let's actually watch a little video of one of my newer style hand cranks in action. So in summary, this video explains how to make a neat crank handle. It also makes your models more fun for both kids and adults to crank the model. Hopefully this video helps you on your projects. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe. Thank you.